Thank you so much for taking the time, man.
Thanks for having me back. I love talking about these things.
Yeah, so you have a number of super interesting books, one being about how America sold its soul. Is that anything to do with Operation Paperclip?
Yeah, it has a lot to do with it because it's not my an original premise with me, but I subscribe to the school of thought that um, the JFK assassination was a coup, and I think that the party driving that um, carried out a silent invasion or infiltration of the United States through Operation Paperclip,
Oh,
because I think it was the Nazi structure, command and administrative structure that infiltrated the U.S. through Operation Paperclip and through influence, um, really gained control of the people and the elements they needed to control to be able to A, pull off the JFK assassination, and B, to continue what they've been doing. This You kind of have to go with an idea that there was a Nazi organizational survival after the war.
mhm.
And what a lot of people don't know about Operation Paperclip is that it was a German idea. It wasn't the idea of our folks, and everybody assumes that it was all about the atomic bomb. Okay, and it wasn't. It was actually about aerospace medicine and aerospace technology primarily. And what do I mean by aerospace medicine? Well, just that. Um, you got to keep pilots and flight crews alive in the air, right? Particularly the higher the altitude, and depending upon what the aircraft is doing. And so this is where aerospace medicine, has always come in, always been a part of putting humans in the sky, and after that in space. These are the guys that really are the ones that make that happen. And the German aerospace medicine specialists were, the experts on this. We had some here in the States and there were some in England. And these guys all knew each other before the war. A lot of them did. They were certainly familiar with each other's work. And so these Germans, towards the end of the war, they came to Colonel Harry Armstrong, who was the U.S. Army Air Corps' commander of the Aerospace Medicine Division. And they pitched him with the idea. They said, "Hey, we're just scientists, we're just technicians. Get us out of here, and we'll work for you, and we'll bring hundreds, thousands of our associates. You'll get our aerospace medicine knowledge, which at the time the Luftwaffe knowledge was, something we wanted, the Allies wanted." But we'll also, we can hook you up with the rocket engineers and the other aerospace engineers themselves and all of that. Okay, so um, space, manned space travel, having been the goal prior to World War II, that's what these guys were all fascinated with, these aerospace medicine guys and these engineers. They wanted to put human beings in space. They wanted to go to the moon. They wanted to go to Mars. And, this had been their dream since they were young. And here, as the war was ending, wow, we can get all the German experts. And so they couldn't pass that up. They went for it. And that's how Operation Paperclip was born. And Harry Armstrong's second in command was the guy who went on to be, when the U.S. Air Force was established a couple of years after the war, he went on to be the commander of the U.S. Air Force Aerospace Medicine Division. And his big goal was putting human beings in space. A lot of people don't know that the U.S. Air Force had the manned space program before NASA even existed. So this whole thing about putting man in space was always part of it. And that becomes a big part of this coup and this takeover that I'm talking about that comes later. And so, all these guys come into the U.S., they're invited in, and they're working with what? Our most classified secrets. And as they advanced U.S. technology, as they moved the U.S. closer into space, and brought us into the jet age and all of that. They created a lot of influence over our military industrial complex. As a matter of fact, they were really instrumental in shaping what our military industrial complex would look like and how it would function and how it would profit and such. So that was a lot of power because we're talking about the height of the Cold War. So they had a lot of power, a lot of influence, and in my opinion, they used that to essentially, if not fully take over, to be able to pull the strings of those who run things and continued to do so, I think, right up to today.
Do you think that, like with those scientists coming over here, that kind of spawned these experiments on like our own citizens, like MK Ultra?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because along with the aerospace stuff, that the Germans were doing, that our specialists knew and admired because it was really great stuff. We got the MK Ultra idea again from German psychiatrists and such. So absolutely, that was a product of all this era and this gaining of this German technological knowledge.
Are you aware of like any other programs that they kind of brought over here?
Well, a lot of it was a lot that there's been a lot developed from what we got from them between MK Ultra, between the aerospace technology, you know, um, there were a lot of subsequent programs that we developed. Like MK Ultra was ours. We got it from, I think it originated in Switzerland and various other places in Europe, but the Germans were really latching onto it and doing things with it. And then we got it. We really went to town on it. Really started developing it. We introduced our military branches to it, MK Ultra, in the early mid 50s, 54, around there, 53. And of all the branches that really liked MK Ultra, the U.S. Air Force liked it the most. And they liked it so much that it's a matter of record. They went off and pursued their own research into MK Ultra with their own program. And to this day, unlike the CIA in 1974, the U.S. Air Force has never been made to report to Congress what they actually developed under MK Ultra. In all the decades since, the Air Force has never had to come clean with how far they advanced it. And of course, with the agency, you had things like MK Often. MK Often was the spookiest of all the MK Ultra sub-programs. That was the one that got into the paranormal and the occult real deeply. Now, if you're familiar with Nick Redfern's research, particularly his reporting in the book Final Events, you hear about this mysterious group colloquially referred to as the Collins Elite. That's not what they called themselves, which started in 1952 officially and pursued occult knowledge, paranormal occult knowledge, allegedly pursued contact with beings in another dimension. And MK Often, was like an MK Ultra extension of that, or maybe even part of what they were doing. So with each of these MK programs, or things like, I think it's Mockingbird, which messed with media, right? With each of these programs, it gave them access to infiltrate different fields of, different professional fields, of, whether it's communications or medicine and such. Like, obviously, a no-brainer, they could infiltrate psychiatry, because certain things that you could learn with MK Ultra could theoretically prove useful in psychiatry, in psychology, that kind of thing. Same with MK Often. Well, in pursuing those things, the agency builds relationships with, say, various experts in churches, like the Catholic Church has very famously their exorcists, right? They're not the only religion with exorcists, but they're the most well known. So, in pursuing these research fields, and these studies, you become acquainted with, and you would, as an intelligence professional, try to ingratiate yourself with people in that field. Okay, so that can be a form of infiltration. Okay, and with something like Mockingbird, where they use the media, there you go. You're infiltrating the media, and all of this, was part of, um, from my perspective, what I write about in the book, NIMSA, How America Sold Its Soul, um, part of an invasion plan, how you subversively take over a host nation. You influence education, you influence politics, you control finance in some way. You create a military industrial complex, okay? And you influence other social aspects of life, be it religion, entertainment, the arts, what have you. And the whole plethora of MK stuff that started with MK Ultra actually started with a couple of smaller programs before MK Ultra itself, but after MK Ultra, this gave them a more subtle, nuanced way to get in. The military industrial complex thing that they helped, us create, that was even more, I don't want to say bold or obvious, but it made it easier for them to get into the heads of politicians, because politicians hold the purse strings to these things, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're going to build, a military industrial complex to your benefit, the idea is for that, the industrial part of that in particular, to have as much money as at its disposal as possible. So, controlling those politicians that hold those purse strings, controlling the commanders, influencing the commanders, into reporting to Congress what it is they need, convincing the civilian leadership that this is what's going to keep us safe in the event that the Cold War goes hot. And they use fear and played upon that fear. Now, all of this I present in the book that I'm describing that was done since World War II to the United States. This follows a playbook that goes back to medieval Germany, before Germany was unified, when it was all the 48 different states. Mm-hmm. This was a very Machiavellian method created by the so-called Prussians. Now, I say so-called Prussians because it was the Junkers merchant class that ingratiated themselves to the Teutonic Knights, and they used that force to pretty much take over the geographical area known as Prussia and move out or eliminate the actual Prussians, and then take over their region, and then kind of adopt the title Prussian. So when we talk these days about, Prussians and, the nefarious ones, the villainous ones, we're really talking about the ones who kind of usurped that territory and that title. But what they did was they would, again, ingratiate themselves with the most powerful entity, body in a region, okay? Make themselves indispensable. Be so woven into their social structure that they were marrying their daughters and sons and stuff like that. And then as they really reached the peak of their influential power with this group that they were latching onto, they would start quietly making overtures to that group's enemy. And as they kept increasing their power and influence, they were building a relationship with this group's, the original hosts, enemy. And then at some point, they make their move over to that enemy, betraying the first group that served as their host. And then they do the same thing with that enemy, and then hop to that enemy's enemy and on and so forth until they've reached their peak power. And they felt they did once they got Germany unified, because these are the guys who were really behind unifying Germany. And what they did then was they decided, well, heck, this worked here. Let's do this throughout Europe. Well, why not do it throughout the world? See, and it really fits when you look at history and how, there were pre-unification Germans over here and over there, and then after unification especially, you see them here and there, and then in subsequent decades or the subsequent century, you see, just exactly that they did that they went over there, they're doing a little bit of business, maybe some archaeological research, looking for gold, because the unified Germany went on the gold standard. So that was their big reason for being in South America. And then, of course, in the 20th century, South America becomes a stronghold for them. And after the war, we find all sorts of surviving Nazi bigwigs and mediumwigs all fleeing down there and being protected. That was a result of a couple of centuries of this very methodical approach that they use to go in, ingratiate, infiltrate, ingratiate, then betray. And I started looking at the United States after World War II, and I saw the pattern. It fits the pattern of what these Junker Prussians did in the medieval days on up to today. So we are presently, in my opinion, their current host. Now, this is their own little culture. Okay, this isn't, obviously there's Germany, and then there was Nazi Germany, right? And this group I'm talking about, okay, they were involved with the rise of the Nazi Party, okay, and Nazism, fascism, is an ultimate expression of their vision, okay, and so, after the war, okay, Germany's defeated in the war, but their little thing, their little subculture, their little private, not really a breakaway because it's latched on to, known civilizations, so to speak, known societies. They're going to survive because of this method they use. And right now, we are the host. We've been the host since Operation Paperclip. And it can be really disheartening when you've looked at history, seen history in a different way, the way we've been taught, and you look back and you see, oh, hey, wait a minute, this explains a lot.
It kind of goes to your point, like half of those scientists, I guess, wound up in Russia, and half of them wound up in America, and I guess, a bunch of people wound up in South America as well.
I have not studied closely what they accomplished in the Soviet Union, because when they went over there, it was the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Because there's so much evidence for this idea here in the States that it almost looks like if they tried that over there, it didn't really work. But, I admit that I haven't done a deep dive study on what the Nazi scientists who went to the Soviet Union, what they might have tried to pull.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like historically something changed after World War II, like in America, like something drastic kind of changed.
When you look at the history of Operation Paperclip, one of the things that doesn't get talked about much is that the Air Force got a little egg on its face by the mid to late 50s, because there were people doing their due diligence, and they were discovering, journalists, they were discovering what some of these guys had been involved in during the war, that they, opted not to tell, or the Allied side was aware of it or had reason to suspect it and just decided to kind of, well, maybe it'll go away. One of the things, this is interesting, my dad, when he was in the Air Force in the late 50s, he was in the aerospace medicine division of the Air Force. And one of the things he did was to run pilots through altitude chambers, do ground testing for new designs on pressure suits and spacesuits. His unit that he was in out here at George Air Force Base, which is a closed base now, they did the ground testing for the silver spacesuits that you see in the movie and the TV series, The Right Stuff, the Mercury program. Mm-hmm. If you recall, that was our astronauts that went up, our first astronauts, our first 7 with the Mercury program. And my dad worked under that before it was handed to NASA, because it was developed for the Air Force. And anyway, for his training, one of the things, I remember him telling me about this in the mid-70s, early to mid-70s, they had to watch the films of the German altitude chamber testing. Okay, how the Germans tested the effects of altitude on a human body. And it was gruesome. They would put, the Jewish prisoners in an altitude chamber without a pressure suit. Okay, and not to go too far into it, but the things that does to the human body, one of the things, the eyeballs end up dangling on your cheeks. So, and that's just, one little glimpse. But that's the kind of thing the German aerospace scientists would do. Just let's see what happens, And they filmed it, and these films were captured and turned over, and the U.S. decided, hey, let's use them as training films. That's what they did. And so my dad, remembered that vividly and described it to me, less than 20 years after he saw these things. And one of I can't remember if it's Strughold or which one it is off the top of my head, because I wrote about that in greater detail in another book, in my book Shimmering Light. But he was kind of a well-known guy among the German paperclip scientists, to the public, American public. Mm-hmm. And when it was discovered that he was involved in these tests, that didn't fare too well, and it kind of was egg on the face for the U.S. Air Force. Well, anyway, they ended up sending, because that was part of the plan. After they'd work a while, they were supposed to go back to Germany anyway. But some of these guys got sent back early because of this, unceremoniously, get their butts on planes, get them out of here. One of them was put on a plane to Argentina.
Damn.
Well, there's that, Nazi South America connect. It's like, the rule was they were supposed to go to Germany, but they're sending him down to Argentina. That's interesting. So that was really the kind of the scandal that went on with that. The one of the things you could say that was scandalous with von Braun is there are photos of him, one in particular, where he's wearing his SS uniform, big old smile, seems to be perfectly comfortable and fine with it, having a good old time in a group picture. Now, we're told that he was a very reluctant member of the Nazi Party. And, seems to me that photo could suggest otherwise. He was known Army CID. They had the lodging where the German scientists initially stayed. They had that wired, and it's well known since then that these Nazi scientists and technicians were maintaining their rank structure after coming over here, kind of secretly. They were still maintaining that rank structure in their little private thing. And von Braun was saying all sorts of insulting, mocking, and negative things about the U.S., Now, people say that, over the years he changed, he found God and all that. And he got us to the moon, and so he's a big hero. But what a lot of Americans don't understand is that, as I said earlier, these guys from the time they were young men, young boys, their dream was Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, putting men in space, right? Now, one of the things that this medieval group that I referred to that continued doing this right up until our times with this influence, using the host, betraying the host, getting out of it what you can. Getting out of it what you can part was if your host had the means and the resources to put into your hands what you wanted, then that was the host you used until you used them up, and then you go find another host. Well, from my perspective, they saw the United States, of course, as the big industrial giant after the war and the most likely to get them to space before anyone else. Now, the Russians were out there doing it too. Obviously, their Nazi scientists were pushing them too and making headway. But the ones who latched on to the United States, really, in my opinion, now not all of them. I'm sure some of the the lower level ones would thank their lucky stars that they could even do this and they stayed here and they were good folks. But we're talking about the main ones driving this, including von Braun. They really saw the United States as a means to an end for them to develop their spacefaring technology. Okay, and so when they say, "Oh, von Braun, what an American hero," by way of Germany, World War II, they couldn't possibly see that maybe he was part of an effort just to get this technology developed that their special interest group would really have the essential control over. Okay, this kind of gets into the theory of breakaways, right? Breakaway groups and stuff. At what point does a group with personal special interests, at what point do they take what's been developed and break away with it? See, and that's what I argue that this post-World War II Nazi infiltration group has been using the United States for, is to push us, get us developed to a point where then they can just seize the technology and do their own thing with it.
Do you believe the U.S.'s official narrative with the Apollo missions?
I think what they're guilty of is not telling us everything. But yeah, we went to the moon. In fact, I think it was India or China's moon probes kind of have been proving that. So the Apollo moon landing deniers have been getting slapped on the head lately and getting a little mockery because, like, there it is right there. We went. But I think what they did was they did not tell us everything that was found up there. They did not tell us everything that the astronauts saw or encountered. And yeah, I this idea that after Apollo 17 we just haven't put anyone else up on the moon. I don't think that's true. I think we just went with different technology. So I'm also one who thinks, I don't know this for sure. I'm just saying, based on my research and looking at things and my personal analysis, is that I think we've at least one time tried or have succeeded at putting boots on the ground on Mars. I think we've at least tried it.
Interesting.
But yeah, look, here's how I put it. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they revealed, yeah, actually we sent a crew to Mars in 1980 something or whatever, and we've sent 3 or 4 since blah, blah, blah. Or we have an outpost up there. That wouldn't shock me. I'd say, oh, cool, okay. Because I think they're leading towards, that people talk about the slow disclosure, so to speak. I think that that they've been showing us without admitting it. I think they've been showing us ruins and relics of a past long ago civilization on Mars. But they're kind of, why would they do that? Well, kind of to be able to say, well, we didn't hide it from you. We showed you the Mars feeds,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, because it is going to be a big deal for different reasons when they do admit that. But yeah, I think we've had a class. I prefer to call it a classified manned space program, because the term secret space program was just turned into a clown show with people like Corey Good and those other knuckleheads claiming that they were in an FFP. So I prefer to call it a classified manned space program, but essentially it's secret.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that kind of brings up something else I was going to ask. I guess like the time travel thing, along the lines with like Ingersoll Lockwood, like writing about Baron Trump, 120 something years before any of that happened. Warner von Braun wrote a book that was pretty interesting about a guy named Elon kind of leading men to Mars, which obviously Elon Musk is obsessed with that right now. What do you think of all that?
I think it's real interesting. There's a couple of things you could say about that. You could go way out and say that von Braun had access to whatever the seeing through time technology might be, if it exists. Von Braun, if I remember right, his mother was well known to be a psychic medium. So we don't know, if that was true. We don't know how much, or at least I don't know how much her input might have influenced him writing that. And she might have, if she were legit, she might have had a vision of Elon Musk and these rockets. I do find that very interesting. That cannot be ignored. What the answer to that is exactly, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I said, I could only guess. But there seems to be this interesting thread of, if not time travel, seeing through time.
Yeah.
And we have remote viewing that we all know about, that we're told started in the 70s, but we don't know exactly how soon whatever led to that began. I talk about that a little bit in my time travel guidebook that I wrote, kind of half for fun or maybe half serious. I let people read it and decide for themselves how serious they want to take it. But it's a fun read either way. The idea that I talk about in that book is what I call consciousness-driven time travel. Okay, and the first example we have of this in fiction, big example of it, is Jack Finney's novel Time and Again. Okay, and that came out in 1970. And in 1975, we have Richard Matheson's novel, originally titled Bid Time Return, but they changed the title to Somewhere in Time because the 1980 film was based on that book, very popular film. And it used essentially the identical process, consciousness-driven time travel, where you will yourself back and forth through time, or at least back in time. Something usually yanks you back. And I developed a method that I lay out for the reader to try in my time travel guidebook. I say, okay, here's the examples of it. Here's how I suggest you try it and do it, yourself. But here's what's really interesting about that in relation to remote viewing. Finney publishes his book in 1970. We're told that remote viewing started in 73, I think, 74. And in Finney's novel, you have these cubicles or apartments, little apartment-sized cubicles in an old warehouse. And in each one, there is a time traveler, someone who is sitting there immersed in the clothing and the trappings and the music and everything of the target era that they're wanting to travel to. Okay? Now, in Matheson's novel, he lays down relaxed on a bed, closes his eyes, and he starts thinking about focusing on the very day and time, year that he wants to travel back in time in this place. Well, it reads very much how we're told remote viewers work, where they're sequestered in a private little room, they're comfortable, seated comfortably, and they do their thing. Now, they of course use a protocol, but it's still very much a mental practice, consciousness driven. And in my book, I point out that Matheson had a connection to the military through past service and stuff, and Finney had a connection to the military through past service. Did Finney learn about remote viewing or its precursor before he wrote his novel? Or did they get the idea for remote viewing from his novel? I don't think that's likely. I think it's more likely that Finney learned about something that had been being done. Okay?
Mhm.
And when you talk about the Ingersoll Lockwood book and the Baron Trump stories, and I did a book with a guy named Todd Wood called The Mystery of Ingersoll Lockwood, in which we dive into that. And then in the Time Travel Guidebook, I talk about it more because the artist seemed to know exactly what young Baron Trump would look like in 2016, but back in 1890 something when he did these
Yeah.
illustrations. So, he's the suspected time traveler. But I had been told when I was in the Air Force by my mentor, who he had, by the time he retired, he had 44 years in the intelligence community, the United States intelligence community.
Wow.
Before that, he'd been 101st Airborne Special Ops Army and all that, and then recruited by James Jesus Angleton himself. That was my mentor's mentor, was the legendary
Damn.
Angleton. And I didn't learn that till like years after I had already been mentored by this guy. Anyway, he told me in the mid 1990s, he said, because my research and some weird things I was seeing made me ask him, hey, be serious with me. Time travel, is this thing possible? Is anyone doing it? And he said, oh, let's get in the car. Let's go for a ride. We went out to ride in the middle of the countryside where there was no one else around. And he told me, he says, we've been doing time travel since the turn of the century. Now, that would have been the 1890s when he told me that in the 1990s. The last turn of the century was 100 years before, in the 1890s. Of course, my jaw dropped. I'm like, what do you mean? So was H.G. Wells telling a true story? And he said, you don't need to know that yet. And, okay. So I didn't get, any further elaboration from him on that specifically. But as I learned about remote viewing and got exposed to it and learned that I had been exposed to it as a study target in 1989 and 90, the year I was in Baltimore, I realized, okay, this is a way that we could be looking through time, seeing through time. But there's also stories about exotic technologies. There's two Project Looking Glasses that have been out there. There's the one that's connected with a bunch of hoo-ha that's silly and not true. And then there's one that is briefly referred to that suggests this very thing that we're talking about, a reflective surface that you can see through time and space. Now, I have no proof. I've not seen this. This is just, things that I've heard. And when you look at the context of what we're talking about, you got to pull everything you've heard and know to see if there's a nugget of truth in there. I'm a big nugget of truth guy. Mm-hmm. That's why you can't ignore the wild fantasy stories because they have value. You got to analyze those. Say, okay, is there anything here? And very often there's not anything there. It's just being made up by somebody who wants attention, or money. They think they're going to get money. But occasionally there is something in there, to kind of set aside as a puzzle piece in figuring this out. Personally, I think, and I have reason to think this, but I think we're all capable of traveling through time when we die. This has to do with, if you studied, like the Tibetan view of the afterlife, land of the dead, so to speak, in their Book of the Dead stuff, even in the Egyptian and other traditions, you come face to face with an entity, right, that discusses your life that you just finished with you. The Egyptians, you're weighed against a feather, and in the Tibetan, you go and you take a look, see what you did, and then you get to pick what your next, who your parents are going to be in the next life, and all of that, and so forth. I experienced emerging in my path during a most intense 7 years of my life, esoterically and occultically. I encountered the goddess Hecate. And in the tradition of Hecate, she is the entity that you meet when you die and you go into the underworld, okay, the afterlife, underworld, land of the dead. She's the queen of the crossroads. Mm-hmm. And you meet her, okay, and then she's going to guide you to wherever it is, you're going. And I think that when you die and you face her, she gives you a choice. Now, she stands at the triple crossroad. She's the queen, the goddess of the triple crossroad, where 3 roads intersect. Took me a few years, but then when it hit me after a weird dream, after I had been diving into seriously how do you time travel for a year and a half intensely with my associate Seshari, then I had this weird dream, and then it came to me, the 3 roads intersecting, past, present, and future. She's the goddess of time. She stands at the gate of time and space, but you don't encounter her until you die. Well, that's not true. You can encounter her, but you come face to face with her when you die. Is this tradition? I happen to think that's true. That's likely, true. And so what does that mean as far as time and space? Well, I think the past is you're given the opportunity to go back and relive the life you just finished. Okay? The future road, if you choose that one, you go on to whatever your next destined thing is supposed to be, another life in the flesh, or do you go on, somewhere else? And the middle road, if you stay in there, you just decide to stay in that realm, okay? In that realm of that afterlife. I'm not going to say heaven necessarily, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think that is the best explanation for the triple crossroad, and she stands there at that. She's the gateway to that. So that's what I think as far as, there's some time travel involved there, because if you relive the life you've already lived, you're going back. Your soul, your spirit is literally going back to possess your body, be in your body again. Mm-hmm. There's some other interesting little details and facts about that I think apply, but that's the basic. But I'm at the point where I'm not going to say it's impossible to do consciousness-driven time travel. I'm not going to say it's impossible. Do I know for sure that it's possible? No. But, we have some interesting things, like I talk about in my guidebook, time travel guidebook, and that I've talked about elsewhere. So it's something that I think we learned some stuff about it from some of these paperclip German scientists, because you remember there's the whole mystery of the bell, the Glocke, the Nazi bell. And I do think we certainly got our hands on that information, and maybe even an actual sample, an actual bell. I'm in the school of thought that thinks Kecksburg, the UFO, that was our development of the bell, whatever it was, or applied development of the bell at that time. The mid '60s, I think, is when that happened. But that involved Nazi bell technology development.
So, along with remote viewing, like within, I guess, the government, were they practicing or trying to develop any other methods similar to that we might not be mentioning?
What I learned, the weirdest stuff I learned, which complemented technological things I learned. You see, my mentor was mentoring me before I even reported for duty to Uncle Sam. Now, I started with the FBI, and then I went into the Air Force. And then after the Air Force, I went to work for some other guys in counterterrorism. But my mentor started training me and teaching me very esoteric occult things, practices. Now, I had already started having very strange experiences before he started mentoring me, years before. And he encouraged me to develop my curiosities and the weirdness. For one thing, he told me that my sisters and I had been looked at and watched for a long time, from the time we were born. Okay, and we were in that GATE program, California's version, called Mentally Gifted Minds, where everyone's been talking about that lately, where you get pulled out of the classroom and you have to read. I had to read these compound words on a list, and I pronounced them all just right. And apparently, I did stuff right because the guy in the suit would smile and say, "Thank you, Walter," and I'd go back in the class. And after the first time that I remember it happening, I 2 days later, I'm added to an advanced course I was in second grade. I was added to a course of a class of second and third graders, and such. So, that's kind of one of the things you hear about in these programs. My sisters were in this too. And my mentor told me, he says, they have the same abilities you have, but it scares them. It makes them nervous. He says, you're the one that's curious about this stuff. Like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, because it is interesting. He also said, and he used to give me a hard time about this, he goes, you're also the one that's really into horror movies. So unfortunately, those damn movies have got you thinking that all this stuff is monsters. And, he told me, not all ghosts and things you encounter on the other side are monsters. And then, of course, at one point he said, there's people expecting you to know how to do this stuff. And this stuff included using necromantic methods to contact the dead and get intelligence out of them. I was being told and taught how to do this. And from the perspective of, that's what I do as an intelligence officer. I pull up dead people. I find out stuff about people that they can see across space and time. Okay, if I wanted information on you, okay, and I'm an intel officer and I need information on you, I could go to a person who's been dead for 150 years or more, pull them up, and they can see stuff about you who are alive now and just tell me.
Holy shit!
Things. Yeah, holy shit.
So so was there like a specific method that you guys used to do that, or like a grimoire, I guess? Because in this community, it's called a bunch of different things. Necromancy is one of them, but Solomonic magic is summoning spirits from the dead to kind of do the same thing. I guess John Dee and Edward Kelly kind of doing that with angels.
Well, I was still young enough that I wanted to be, the combination of Bond and Indiana Jones and John Dee, whatever you want to call it, that I just went along with whatever he told me to do. Yeah. And I never used what he trained me to do. Had to do with a particular constellation in the night sky, a particularly prepared leather lanyard that I wear while doing it, and just how to pick my target and what time of day and that kind of thing. He didn't tell me the tradition. I couldn't tell you today what tradition this, he called it the string, I call it the string. Oh, and by the way, he taught me to do this for the first time in 1986, and since 1986, I have always worn one of those. It's in my pocket over there now, because I was changing shirts and stuff, but when it gets old and breaks, I just make a new one. But we're talking for, what is that, 39 years?
Holy
Is that right? Yeah. So, you know, that's how long, and it's useful for other things as well too, but that's one of the things that he taught me. And it's really, it's a concentration connection thing. You go out there at the right time, when, as Lovecraft would say, the stars are right, I guess. When you can see a particular star, you go out there, you focus on the person that you've selected, and eventually you'll make that connection and they will appear before you. Now, I didn't get that far. Believe me, even though big bad stud FBI guy or Air Force guy or whatever, okay, when you're talking the land of spooks, okay, that's not just some guy coming at you with his fist, knife, or a gun, right?
Yeah.
That's something, you know, otherworldly. Yeah, it was kind of eerie, because when I first did it, was in an old colonial cemetery in Northport, Long Island. You can look it up online and see how creepy and eerie it is. And it was creepy and eerie then. And, you know, that's a place I never would have. Now I'd probably go walking through it, you know, midnight. Maybe not by myself, but there I was, you know, because I was instructed to do this. And so there's a method of the necromancy, if I want someone to look across, because these dead people could also see across time, according to him, you know. So that was an example of some of the weird stuff that I was being taught as my career was taking off. Now, to come around the long way to answer your question, there was that going on in my life, and this mentor, no matter who I worked for, FBI, Air Force, or whoever, I would still have to report to him weekly. If he wasn't like there in town to physically meet with, I'd have to call him weekly and, you know, either get stuff from him that he needed to tell me, or me kind of fill him in on how my week's going. And, you know, most of it he knew already because he had people watching me. So there was that going on, and he was very instrumental in my FBI career, Air Force, and all of it. Okay. But I would learn the weirdest stuff from him or others while off base, while not in official capacity, right? I would get briefed on, you know, the things that the Air Force, the FBI, whoever would brief me on, go to the vault, get the whole thing. From that perspective, and then the weird stuff would kind of fill in the blanks, right? Why would they do it that way? Culpable deniability. So if I flip my lid and decided to be a big mouth and start talking about this stuff on Coast to Coast, as they were telling me, they could deny it. They could say, this guy's nuts. Yeah. You know, he never got briefed on that stuff in the Air Force. We've got all his official briefing docs right here. None of that. It gives them culpable deniability because they tell you in an unofficial setting. You know, the weirdest stuff I was told was usually, not all the time, but late at night, get away from the house because the house is listened to, and, you know, told out in the middle of nowhere, out in the countryside, you know, so where no one could hear what was being said. So that's how I experienced learning the weirdest stuff. Okay, I can't speak for others. Maybe others got all of this in a vault briefing. I sincerely doubt it. Now, my vault briefing stuff, that was interesting enough as it was, you know. But yeah, it was as if I felt like I was being tailored for something else. That my time in the FBI was kind of training ground, testing ground kind of thing, and then going to the Air Force and become an agent there, and what I did there, and then the other guys I worked for encountered that it was all some type of tailoring me for what would ultimately be some involvement perhaps in what this Collins Elite actually was. Or maybe I was involved in it already without knowing it. You know, because I was told things like, my mentor said, I'm your mentor, but you have a sponsor. And he tells me this like over 10 years into, you know, or actually over 15 years into his mentorship. And he goes, you have a sponsor. And I'm like, who's that? He goes, you don't need to know that now, but he's a United States congressman or senator.
Whoa.
And I thought, wow, okay, why? You know, and then he explained to me a little bit about the structure, that I was one of 4 people that he was mentoring. And there were other guys out there that had, you know, several. And we come from all different walks of life, work for different agencies and stuff like that. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
You know, I was a federal agent, so yes, it didn't escape me that, what the hell is this that I've actually been involved in, unbeknownst, you know? But no, you know, it's you know, the intel spook world. Oh yeah, multi-layered, and you don't always know what's actually going on.
That's insane, man. Which honestly, it gives you like a really unique perspective on all this research that you do. Did he ever like do that in front of you, or like give you any examples of when he kind of performed necromancy or anything like that? Anything wild?
The stuff that I recall witnessing, the stuff he would do, he would show up in places that I did not expect him to show up in. I'm out here in California working for the FBI, and I'm actually on one of my operational tasks. Our team has followed our Soviets, back then they were Soviets, followed them over to Reno. Okay? Now they're supposed to stay on the California side, but they walk across, you know, the state line. Anyway, they walk across to where the casinos were and stuff, because that was naughty. They were Soviets. They weren't supposed to do that, but they all did it. But that's not the reason we're watching. But anyway, I'm in this casino, and there's my mentor, standing right there next to the, you know, the spinning wheel thing. You can lay down a buck and they spin the wheel. Mm-hmm. And he's standing there and he's looking at me. When I notice him, big grin. Somebody makes a noise. I glance away. I look back. He's gone. And there were times where, now remember, he lived in the Southeast. He lived in Alabama. He passed away some years back. But, you know, so I had no knowledge of him being out west, you know, when that happened. Certainly he could have been. Mm-hmm. He would turn up, like when I was at officer training school, okay? My class is the class that we did our first half at Lackland and then closed everything up there for officer training school and moved it to Maxwell in Montgomery, Alabama. And that's where he lived. That's he was my uncle, one of my mom's brothers. And that's where, you know, they were from. So, of course, he's a veteran, so he has access to the base, but I would have secret little powwows with him during officer training school. When I did not have privileges to go down to the BX, because that's the little game they play when you're in training, he would tell me, meet me there at such and such o'clock. Don't worry about, you know, your privileges. Okay, so I go walking down there, and I'd sit in his pickup truck, and he'd tell me about people in my flight, my training flight, by name. He'd say, watch out for that guy, watch out for that guy. This guy over here you can trust. This guy here is not really a trainee. He's already a bird colonel. He's there undercover. You know, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I was seen by one of the trainee snitches. I was informed later, and he told our flight training officer, "Oh, Bosley's been violating me," and not a word was ever said to me. When I was doing my physical fitness test, the final one, these 2 guys who I'd never seen before in my life, and I don't think I've seen them since, they show up in their workout clothes and sunglasses and hats so that I can't see their features. They know my name. They're going, come on, Walter, do it. One more, you know, that kind of thing. And my flight training officer was just, who are these guys? So, you know, weird stuff like that. yeah, and then when I was working for a completely different organization, and in my training for that, he shows up there, you know. So anyway, yeah, it was, I don't know. There it is.
Did you ever like use necromancy to find out stuff in the government or help solve any kind of case, I guess?
Yeah, well, you know, some folks would say anytime I use the string, that is necromancy. Now, after I had for a long time felt a presence around me, but after having lived on Long Island and initiated what he taught me to do, I really felt a presence around me at times. And when I was at Wright-Patterson with Air Force OSI, I had my apartment off base. I would sit there at night and I'd be looking at the computer screen in my living room, just typing away, you know, writing stuff. And I would hear someone walking around behind me, and I would feel them walk up right behind me. And I would feel it. And I would, you know, just kind of pause and then slowly turn around, and there'd be no one there. I told, you know, one of my guys who worked for me, one of my senior NCO agents, I said, hey, I think I got a ghost in my apartment. And he goes, oh man, when you moved in over there, I was going to tell you, but there was an airman who had committed suicide in that apartment complex. And I'm like, oh great, I got his apartment. So I'm thinking it's the ghost of this young guy. And I'm very hard on psychic mediums, okay? I don't just sit there and go, golly, to everything they say, because there's so many frauds. Yeah. There's liars and fakes who are out to get your money, okay? They call themselves psychics, and we know the games that they play.
Yeah.
So I'm difficult on them. I make them tell me and convince me stuff, and I don't give them anything. Well, long story short, I had developed an association with one who I very much trusted. Okay, she was down to earth, no BS, you know. And so I went to her with this, and she's the one that told me. She said, no, that isn't a ghost that was there. First of all, it's a female, and you brought her with you. Damn. She's attached to you, and she doesn't mean you any harm. She watches out for you and such. And oh wow, okay, that kind of makes some sense, because my mentor had taught me some things about the Odyssey of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he had been teaching me a couple of years before I went to work for the FBI. Let's jump back to 1986 now. He was telling me about this female entity that appears before him, and started appearing before him when he was in the 101st Airborne in the Army, about that time of his life. And she continued to appear before him. And so between that and him guiding me on studying and getting to know the Iliad and the Odyssey, okay, understanding how to read them in a particular way, he said, when you read these books properly, the way I'm going to teach you, you will begin to understand things in your own life better. Okay. Well, I kind of took to Athena. Okay. The idea of Athena really intrigued me. And so, long story short, I kind of, in the intervening years, I became what I call an Athenist. I go out on a limb, you know, I think Athena watches out for me, you know. And I've since come to understand better who Athena is an aspect of, or may actually be, and I think that's Hecate. So I have had encounters with Hecate and with things of her dimension and realm, particularly between the years of 2007 and 2014, when I had officially learned remote viewing in 2007.
Oh,
Now,
shit.
my mentor, and I was pretty much natural at it, but I didn't learn the actual RV protocol until 2007, and that opened my life and world up to an intense 7 years that introduced me directly to Hecate. And so I think that I was on that path and might have been led on that path by whatever, someone would call necromancy, exposed me to. And I understand there's people out there going, oh, pray for him, pray for him. It's like, okay, if that's your particular vernacular here in the West, anything that's not white bearded daddy in the sky, it must be the devil. I don't live fearful like that. But so I think indirectly, maybe more directly than that, I think the necromancy stuff, the methods, I don't call it necromancy when I do it. That's what other people who are worried about me, because I call it. The method.
Yeah, that's like the scary word, I guess, for
yeah,
whatever,
it scares the hell out of people. Just because, all because of, Western religion, the perspective, and specifically American puritanical fundamental evangelism.
100%.
Specifically. But, there's others. But that's getting into the history of, religions and stuff. So I think that certainly, it's been an influence, but I think it's opened me up to knowledge and understanding that I would not have had otherwise. And I don't stand out there under the stars at night with a cone-shaped hat, doing stuff with incense and elixirs around me. I don't do things like that, but anyway.
So remote viewing, I guess your experience, you were able to kind of be introduced to some of these otherworldly beings or other dimensional beings?
It was interesting. I used to not talk about this, but now I do.
It's fascinating, man.
Story.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
In spring of 2007, I had experienced about a solid year and a half of just drudgery. Nothing was working. Nothing I tried. I was miserable. The relationship I was in was failing, just not working. I was broke, nearly broke. Nothing. That was it. I was pissed off and ready to check out. In fact, I remember the night I had a talk with the old bastard upstairs, and I said, you know what? I'm sick of your design. I'm sick of your system. I'm sick of this, kiss your ass just the right way and you'll get a reward in heaven kind of narcissistic crap. Here's the deal. You clearly hate me. You clearly, blah, blah, all this feeling sorry for myself kind of anger. So I told him, I said, you SOB, you want me dead, obviously, but guess what? I'm not giving you the satisfaction. You got to take me out yourself. Do it tonight. I beg you. I don't want to wake up in the morning, blah, blah, blah. But I was sincere. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny then.
Yeah.
I was really low. So I go to sleep that night. Naturally wake up the next morning. Because what's the old bastard going to do? Oh, so you want to go? I'm going to leave you down there, you smart ass great, So what's interesting is I was up for maybe an hour, and I got a call from a complete stranger who said a friend of his heard me on a radio show. And at that time, I had been talking about my Disneyland research, which would be released in the book subsequent to that. And we ended up talking for 3.5 4 hours. Complete stranger. And it ended up with he was naval intelligence. He was retired from the Navy, but he had been in naval intelligence. And so, I'm thinking, my mentor was still alive then. I said, my mentor sent him. That has to be the case. I never got confirmation on that, but he ended the conversation with, what, have you ever heard of remote viewing? It's, yes, I have. At the time, I had the real interesting story, but I didn't tell him that with my exposure to that in Baltimore in 89 and 90, because that didn't get confirmed until a few years after what I'm talking about here, 2007. So he said, I'd like to teach you remote viewing, send you the protocols, the discs, and I'll teach you. I'm like, okay, sure, because I had heard of it. So some things happened after that. He sent me the stuff, but some things happened that I couldn't really focus on it. My dad was assaulted by a former employee that, severely ended up in the hospital. He ended up dying 11 months later, but he was in a coma for 45 days. And so, that was, of course, a major distraction. Anyway, long story short, I end up finally getting into it in September of 2007 and really take to it. And then I was off to the races. Weird stuff was coming to me through it. And, that we would have to do like a 3-hour show for me to go into all the details on that. But it really opened me up to stuff that has led really led to all the nonfiction books that I've written so far, plus the one time travel novel as well.
Yeah. Was there anything like specific that you were looking for, like through all of that?
With the remote viewing training?
Yeah.
He wanted to teach me to do it, and then he kind of brought me into this group he had where he would give us targets and then, kind of pool the data to see if we could like find missing persons and that kind of thing. But what happened was I remote viewed an object in the town next to mine over in Riverside, and what came back was a particular shape, design kind of thing. And about a week or so later, I'm in downtown Riverside, and I walk down this one street that I'd never been down before, and there was a clock tower with that exact shape. And I immediately recognized, whoa, what's going on here? And it ended up being that it was turned into a monument. It was built like in 1969 or 70, but in 71 it was turned into a monument for two ambushed, slain police officers. And that was in the era of the Zodiac Killer. And I found out subsequently that there is a telluric current energy line that goes straight from that tower down through the city, several blocks to where Riverside City College is, but it specifically goes right through the site of the Zodiac Killer murder victim, Sherry Jo Bates, who was murdered on October 30th, 1966, I think. And the spot where she was murdered, this telluric current goes straight through. Now, when I give people tours for my books on this, Empire of the Wheel, I take them to the spot where she was murdered. And I was able to identify it through the photographs. Because with the photographs of the day where you see her body there, you see the houses and the trees and the structures and stuff. And to this day, you can totally stand there and go, yep. And I was able to triangulate the spot. That's just a taste of the weirdness that it opened up to me.
I guess when you like realize, hey, it's like something that's actually possible and I can do, was there anything you tried?
Yeah. I would get results in a remote viewing session, and then I would want to elaborate, go deeper into that result. And there was, I'd have to look at the page, but I remember there was a target related to this stuff in Riverside, and Catalina Island. And so I did the remote viewing on the target that I designed, that I had formulated from that. And I ended up with the ship of Juan Cabrillo, the Portuguese explorer, you know, who was an officer in the Spanish army, who led the expedition, 3 ships, the first Spanish expedition to explore the coast of what we know as California, Upper California, Alta California, up Baja. And that led to my book, my first secret missions book, The Hidden Legacy of Old California, because stuff with Juan Cabrillo kept emerging. Okay, and the connection to Hecate is that what I lay out in this book about Juan Cabrillo, Secret Missions 1, is that he was looking for Templar sites. Okay, and I propose that, see, Juan Cabrillo died on that expedition, and we don't know to this day where he was buried. And there's, even among the men who were there, there's multiple versions of how he died. So somebody's lying, right? And you would think that after 400 years or so, we would know where the guy's buried. We'd find him, okay? There's been attempts, but they end up not being, you know, fruitful. So we don't even know where he's buried. So I asked the question in the book, did he die then? And I proposed what else he could have done. I proposed that there was a Templar vault in Mount Rubidoux, which is in downtown Riverside, California, which has a reputation for having an ancient tomb. Okay, well, not a tomb, what about a vault? And I propose in the book that there were relics in this vault, one of them being the sword of Joan of Arc. Kid you not, when you read the book, you get the context, because her sword, to this day, no one knows where it's at.
Damn.
And, you know, I go into the details on why the sword was special, okay? And I think that Cabrillo had a mission, his secret mission was that he faked his death, he slipped away, adopted a new identity, slipped away, took custodianship of Joan of Arc's sword, and then went on as the custodian of it to the next place. And I think he took it at least to one of the Pacific Islands, but maybe all the way to Japan. I have reasons for thinking that. And then wherever it was he really ended up and where his life ended, we don't know yet. But why Joan of Arc's sword? What does this have to do with all this weird stuff that I was RVing and all this Hecate stuff? Well, Joan of Arc famously was communicating with 3 entities, okay? Spiritual entities, okay? One of them was known as Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Well, there was no such thing as Saint Catherine of Alexandria. She is what we call a syncretic creation, okay? When the Roman Catholic Church can't get rid of the veneration and worship of, you know, the old so-called pagan gods. In other words, they can't beat them, so they let them join them. And what they do is they paste on a phony biography and give that pagan being, that other being, that entity, that god or goddess, a saint's name. There was never, and the church admitted this years ago, there was never a St. Catherine of Alexandria. They took the biography of Hypatia of Alexandria, then they made up a bunch of churchianity type crap to show how devout this fake Catherine was. And they called her St. Catherine of Alexandria. And for the longest time, for centuries, this was how Catholics were venerating and devoting to the goddess Hecate, and didn't know it. Some of them knew it. Even her symbol is a wheel, just like Hecate's symbol, okay? So Joan of Arc was mainly directed by Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Let's call her who she was, the goddess Hecate. You know, the forbidden, you know, for churchianists to even talk about, was the one guiding Joan of Arc.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and there's more details about this. I go into this in the Secret Missions 1 book.
Yeah.
So there's your Hecate connection. This, I think, is why in my experience, growing experience with Hecate, and in my remote viewings, the Juan Cabriel stuff showed up, because that Hecate thread.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm right about the Joan of Arc sword, you know, and I know that's a big if, but you know, we're here to talk about these weird big ifs, you know. So that's just one example of what remote viewing did, was open my eyes to a huge fabric of all sorts of threads of reality, and I started pulling them, and you can't stop pulling. You cannot unsee this. Your life is never the same. There's no going back. On and on, so forth.
Man, that's fascinating. I completely agree. I feel like there's something like a part of this world that is just kind of hidden from, I guess, the mainstream. Do you think that's on purpose, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Most people are conditioned, and they try to get you through, you know, as early as possible. What we have in the West. We have a particular brand of monotheism, which is insidious at its core. It is narcissistic. What it does, it is self-verifying. You know, I am this. You must do that. This book that I give you says so. You know, don't doubt me, or that's the devil. It's very narcissistic.
Yeah.
It's egotistical and narcissistic, this being. Now, if you look at, that's a whole other discussion, but it's the Yahwist monotheisms, okay? They're the ones that really control, you know, two of them in particular control the West. But, and the other one, you know, influences very much. Yeah, it's a very egocentric, I hate to use this word because it's so trendy, but it is a patriarchal, you know, system. One of the first things they did, okay, they felt the need to demonize goddesses just as fast as they could. They had to silence the voices of the goddesses. They had to control the women, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not, anybody will tell you, I'm not like, you know, one of these, you know, white knights for the ladies, you know, kind of thing. I'm just your average American who, you know, grew up with a mom who worked, wasn't a pushover, and you know, I got sisters who aren't, you know, you know, hey, we don't treat women like second citizens like they did in the 1800s or something, you know.
Some churches still do. They don't allow women in like leadership roles. I mean,
you
get in trouble for bringing that up, but
you got a couple of. I talk about this in the NIMSA book, so I'm glad you brought it up. Mm-hmm. There is a particular brand of this, okay, that two of their prominent pastors are very known now, currently. They're dead serious for wanting to, they propose this, they don't think women should have the vote anymore. They think in the household, the man, the father, the husband, should vote for the household. That the women should not have a vote. In 2025,
that's wild.
These guys proposed this. They're not. They've cloaked themselves in religion and faith, but they are a political entity, and it's theocratic fascism. There's no other way to put it. It's theocratic fascism, and I find it to be just evil what they're doing. And it's out there, and I talk about, you know, I tip people off, and I came out with this book 2 years ago, and I was talking about these guys, identifying them 2 years ago, some of them by name, saying, hey, you got to watch these guys, and sure enough, they've ended up being very influential, you know, in Washington. And I know there's people that they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that. You must be some crazy lefty. Nope. I've never been a registered, lefty or Democrat or anything.
Yeah.
I'm a veteran, former federal agent. I always tell people I am right of center. I'm a conservative guy. Okay, and I don't like to talk about how I vote, but let's just say sincere voters' remorse, is going on. But yeah, I don't want to steer your show into
No, it's okay.
politics, but it's kind of you got to be on the edges of it to discuss what this group is doing, and this group I'm talking about. Okay, Christian nationalism. Let's call it exactly what they call themselves. This, folks, you might not see it, but you ultimately will. This is a product of this fascist infiltration, this Nazi, post-World War II Nazi infiltration, and, pulling off the coup with the assassination of JFK, that this Christian nationalism is, they may not see it that way, but they are a product of this Nazi, post-war Nazi influence. This is what I found through my research and analysis. So, and I know that's not going to be, there's going to be people that are just going to be, just yelling at their computers when they hear this, or watch this. But
well, I mean, there's a lot there, because I just feel like a lot of it is just manipulation, and right from the start, they're like, hey, don't look into certain information. It's demonic, or if you hear voices, that's demonic. But if they hear voices, it's God.
Exactly.
So they're kind of defining it and kind of running it to a certain direction while like telling you what not to do. It's
exactly. There, don't do as I do as I say, but watch me do what I told you not to do. It goes. I recommend a couple of books. I recommend Yahweh, the Two-Faced God by Joseph Farrell. Okay, who is an expert at he's an expert academician of theology. Okay, he knows what he's talking about, that stuff. And Yahweh pretty much is not a god. He's a being that is a lesser being who set himself up as an almighty God, and has always used narcissistic, power over, people that are easily influenced by that. And Yahweh is the same as Allah and Jehovah. Okay, it's the same entity of the three religions of the of the book. And Yahweh isn't even a name. Yahweh's a title. It means chief or warlord. So, the idea is that he came from somewhere else, he and his entourage, and they said, oh, look at these beings here. They're fools. We can set ourselves up pretty good here. And that's essentially, what he did. But, I recommend books, but I also recommend watch Star Trek V. Okay, the movie Star Trek V. Watch the scene in particular where they allegedly meet God on the planet. Okay? The interaction with Kirk and this so-called God is basically, in a nutshell, what I'm talking about here. Okay? With, hey, wait a minute. Why does God, what does he need with a starship? And then he gets mad and acts like, Yahweh would. But yeah, again, we could go on. There's the whole thing where, the people tell me, oh, yeah, that's the other thing they do is you're misinterpreting. Don't you dare throw our scripture back at us. But when Christ says to the main priests of Yahweh, Jehovah, whatever, he says, you are the sons of your father, the devil, and liars. And he says this to the priests who's supposed to be. See, I come from the perspective that this God being that the Christ figure talks about is a different God being, is not this Yahweh character.
Gotcha.
See, that's the way I look
at it.
So
they're kind of different, whoever Jesus is talking about.
Yeah. They're different beings. But again, my mentor taught me a long time ago. He said, there's one thing you got to understand, Walter: many gods, one Almighty. He taught me early that there's a pantheon. Okay, but the monotheists who control the West greatly, they don't like that. They don't like people to know that.
Yeah.
Did I meander off what we were supposed to talk about wildly?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's all super interesting. Do you think there's a reason why they changed his name to Jesus? Was it just to sell him to, like, white people in the West? Or are they actually, like, trying to, like, summon something by, like, drinking the blood every Sunday and eating the body? There's a lot of weird rituals within that.
There's the blood drinking, the vampiric aspect of it, which some interesting things have been written about that too. Remember, Jesus is, after we get through all the iterations of these scripture that compile what we call the Bible, you get through all these different languages, we land on Jesus, right? That there's Yeshua. It just all depends on the language that you're talking about. I think what we know as Christianity, I've learned a term from Joseph Farrell and others that I like to use. I call it churchianity. Okay? There was this guy Jesus, and then a few centuries later, they created Christianity, which is really just churchianity, created by Rome, very cynically to continue their empire, just with a different mask on, really.
Vatican.
And so you got to remember, they're out of Rome. Of course, there was the schism with the Eastern Church, the Orthodoxy, which I have a lot more respect for. But out of Rome came the Reformation, right? Think about it. The Protestant Reformation, they're still a product of the Roman Church. Okay? In fact, some scholars, they just called it something. It's more of an iteration of Rome, not really a complete breakaway. It's just a rebranding, so to speak. And then out of the Protestant Reformation, we got these wackos who were called the Puritans. Okay, and they got it into their heads that convert, kind of like the Muslims, convert or die. The ancient Hebrews with Yahweh would say, I want you to have their real estate and go slaughter every man, woman, and child because I want you to have that land.
Yeah.
Oh, gee, does that sound familiar? Anyway, I digress. So the Puritans, they like this bloodthirsty brand, they're going to force their stuff on everybody. And for a while, they've got control of Parliament, right? Cromwell and all that. But eventually, they have to leave England. And Europe doesn't want anything to do with those wackos. So they come to the Americas, and of course they come to Massachusetts. They burn women and accuse them of being witches and all their crazy, insane stuff, which the other colonies are saying, you keep that crap up there. It's not welcome down here. So they eventually had to change their style. Okay, and that became American evangelistic Protestantism. So all this American evangelism is really just the product of the nutty Puritans, the witch burners. Okay, that should help explain some of their nutty behavior and some of their, what they hate and who they don't approve of and that kind of thing, because they're a product of the Puritans. And that's where we're at, and this is what we're handed and told that, we're supposed to follow this. Now, of course, there's different denominations, and, a lot of them out there like, those guys are nuts. I want nothing to do with them, But this whole religion thing, it has a real tight grip on folks, and yet a lot of it, it's a creation of mankind. Okay, of humans. So it's flawed. Yeah. And it has been used way too much to control people, to control the masses, to beat them down, to, convince them to just keep putting up with the narcissistic abuse, of either their political leaders or the church leaders or what have you, with this, you better do it or God will be unhappy with you kind of thing. And anybody who pulls the veil off their eyes, has to be immediately ostracized and demonized, because otherwise it won't work. It's a very collectivist kind of society.
Kind of seems like it just shuts people off spiritually in a way. Pretty much.
It intends to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it intends to. I mean, particularly there's no such thing as reincarnation. Well, that's one of the biggest things they needed to erase from this Roman system of religion was, oh no, we can't have reincarnation, because if these people think that they'll be born, literally reborn and getting into multiple lives, we won't have that much control over them. And it's all about control for, these particular religions.
Yeah. Super interesting. Well, I really appreciate your time. You mind if I ask just one more question?
Not at all. Go ahead.
What's your take on like what happened with Charlie Kirk and like the official narrative that they're kind of feeding us? Any
I think that that was horrific and tragic to see that happen the way we did.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really not happy with and bothered by the sanctification of this guy. Okay, this man was clearly flawed and not the Mr. Wonderful. I mean, there are people that are making him out to be almost like a prophet. I find that offensive to our intelligence, offensive to the very, religion that they're trying to, cloak this in. I'll throw a name at you that I've seen emerge more. I was saying it from day one, from this ridiculous memorial show that they did. That was really just a
WWE kind
of. Horst Wessel, Charlie Kirk is Christian nationalism's Horst Wessel. Look him up, Wessell. You'll see how the Nazi Party used him in the 30s. And Charlie Kirk is their Horst Wessel.
So do you think it was like that kid, I guess, that they're claiming killed him? Or
no. I think there's more people involved in this than that. It might have been even somebody in their own group, because if those of us who are seeing Kirk being used as a Horst Wessel for their cause, well, it would serve them to, off him themselves. So that's possible. And I'm speaking as an experienced investigator.
Yeah.
You have to consider all possibilities. Okay, but this ridiculous, this young guy, because he had a transgender girlfriend, come on.
Yeah, that just seems like something that kind of pit, right versus left, and it almost seems too easy to like try to do. I mean, the first day I was like, that just sounds like complete horseshit.
It is horseshit. It's terrible what was done to this guy. I mean, I wouldn't. No, that wasn't right that was done. But let's stop with the sanctification BS.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy was not, and they say that, oh, he's bringing thousands and thousands to the church. Are you kidding me?
Well, the wife is already like using it to raise more money for the organization or Turning Point, and
well, I think their marriage, their relationship was a setup to begin with. I'm in that camp.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about that. That I guess they met over in Israel,
and what I heard was she thought it was a job interview. Their first meeting, date, or whatever. She thought it was a job interview. So I'm cynical about her and her motives, and the fake grief at this Nuremberg rally. Oh, did I say that? It's
well, it's like one thing if like your husband like dies, and it's just a whole nother thing if he gets shot in the throat and bleeding out in front of like the entire world, and to be out there like the next day. I don't know. It just seems very, very odd.
Okay, and on that, one last thing on that, in my book, Nimza, How America Sold Its Soul, when I talk about this medieval group, okay, that used their little power to control the German states and stuff, eventually what was created was this mysterious group. I never know how to pronounce it. The FEMA or the FEMA or something. It's spelled FEHME, a German word. They were like a punishment squad. And what were they famous for? They were famous for committing violent assassinations in public. And people knew, and the leaders would not commit and say, this was those junkers, this was those Prussian evil guys. They would say, oh golly, I don't know. I wonder who did this. We don't know. Okay, because they were scared that they'd be next. So what was done, and I talk about this, what was done to JFK, very violent, very shocking, very public, and the hallmark is the perpetrators are never identified in this, and this goes back to this medieval group called the FEMA, okay? The FEMA or whatever, okay? And the JFK assassination matches that. RFK assassination matches that. Martin Luther King, all these political assassinations, and Charlie Kirk, his matches the hand of the FEMA, okay? This old German, Prussian, become Nazi organization.
Yeah, what do you think about like Kash Patel and a couple of those other guys throwing out the 33? We got them in 33 hours. They're throwing out the 33. Like
Kash Patel, I was initially kind of enthused about him, and wow, he has just proven to be a huge disappointment. Incompetent. I still have associates who still work for the FBI, and they think he's a complete idiot.
Yeah,
they can't stand it.
Do you think that's like a signal to people, like that they're kind of like misleading, like the 33? Like I saw that a bunch during COVID. Like there's 33 new cases. Like all of the news stations said, like there's like a clip online of it where it's like hundreds of them saying there's 33 new cases in this city, and they're all different cities, all different news stations. Do you think that's a signal for something?
It could be, because you're talking about 33 is a very esoteric number. What does it do to the human psyche? Now that's interesting that you asked that, because I've never done a specific deep dive analysis on what that number or other numbers would do to the human psyche, and now I'm going to look at that. So that's very interesting. I have a booklet, a private book. I have the only copy, written by hand for me by my associate Shadowy, an interesting guy, on his esoteric analysis of numbers. And so I'm going to dive into that tonight to see what he might have to enlighten about the number 33. But you're right, when they throw numbers out like that, what does it do to the mind of the public? What kind of seed does it plant? Or what doors does it close?
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about it like that. Well, hey, I really appreciate your time. And
thanks for having me on. I appreciate people being interested in hearing me talk about stuff.
Well, man, you're super fascinating. You have a ton to kind of lay out for anybody. Would you like to just give a shout out where people can find your work?
Yeah, absolutely. WalterBosley.com. You can get my books there in the walterbosley.com/shop. And then I also have a YouTube channel, the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. And I'm going to be, I'm going to be expanding into some overseas, outside the U.S. markets here real soon. And I'm excited about that. So I'll probably have something to say about that on my channel or at the .com in the future. So if anyone's interested in that, keep an eye there.
Yeah. Well, man, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate that.
Thank you.